fourth officer of the Europe wrote a letter to his father on September 8th, 1803, disclosing the following information. Quote, "We saw a small boat on our starboard bow, which, upon pearing, we discovered to have only one sail set, and otherwise to be a perfect wreck. No one was observed to be on her deck until, upon hailing her, a wretched object presented himself, apparently in a most distressed situation, and in the posture of imploring our assistance."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Castaway on a Shallop?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The man discovered by the Europe was a 26-year-old man named Robert Scotney, and he had departed from England on March 4th, 1802, on board of a brig named the Thomas, under the command of Captain Gardner. The Thomas was a whaling and sealing vessel, and though they stopped at several other places during their voyage, they did not encounter any whales, and decided to focus on sealskins instead. Their eventual destination was Staten Island, Argentina. Disaster had nearly struck them early on, though it had been averted. They had sent the ship's first mate on shore of an island with 5 men, hoping they could collect hogs, goats, and anything else edible to add to their diet. While the first mate was on shore, however, a gale suddenly blew in, and the Thomas was driven off of the shore. It would not be until 14 days had passed that they were able to return to the island and take back on board the men they had left there. The men had spent a miserable 14 days on an uninhabited island, not certain if the Thomas would return for them or not, and with very little in the way of supplies. This would prove to only be a hint at what the future held for Robert Scotney, however. They arrived safely at Staten Island, and spent 7 months there, time that was clearly successfully spent because they left with about 800 skins. While they had been on Staten Island, they had also converted the ship's longboat into a shallop. They lengthened it, gave her a deck, and schooner-rigged her. Robert Scotney, who was the second mate of the Thomas, was decided as the best person to command their new shallop, and they put 3 sailors under his command to sail it. The shallop was given the order to accompany the Thomas to their next stop, the island of Georgia, and the shallop successfully made the 11-day journey with no difficulty while in the company of the Thomas. They remained in Georgia for 2 months, and at the start of April 1803, they decided to move on again. This time they had company. A brig out of Boston named the John was now also planning on traveling with them. The 2 brigs and the shallop, still under the command of Robert Scotney, left Georgia to head to the island of Tristan da Cunha. On the 14th of April, their voyage was interrupted by a strong gale that separated the shallop from the 2 brigs, though as night fell, the people on the shallop could still see the 2 brigs about 2 or 3 miles to the lee of them. The storm was a powerful one, but the 4 men were still confident in their ability to ride it out and be reunited with the brigs later. 3 of the men went to rest below decks, leaving 1 man on deck at the helm. As the night progressed, the waves grew and buffeted the boat, but the 3 men who had gone to rest still did not feel enough alarm at the situation to return back on deck. It would not be until 10 o'clock in the evening, when a particularly large wave crashed over her, that the 3 men were forced to rush back into action. The impact of the wave on their boat had been strong enough to knock all of the men from their hammocks, and it was admitted by Scotney that they had gone onto the deck of the boat with the greatest alarm and terror. The ballast on the boat was not supported with anything, and the powerful wave caused it, as well as the small salt cargo, to shift to lee. Once the boat was on beam ends, the shifted ballast kept her there, and the men who had been resting now were forced into action to try to right the boat again. Their greatest hope at doing so would be to shift the boat around so that the waves would buffet her other side, and, hopefully, a similar impact would shift the cargo and ballast back to where it belonged. The men kept their heads in the emergency, and while the man at the helm shifted the helm, another rushed to hoist the jib, and another ran to sound the pump. Scotney realized that there was some rigging and sail that he would need to cut away, and he ran below again to get a knife. Scotney was not to know, but his timing in running to get the knife would be all that saved him. After he rushed below deck, another massive wave crashed over the vessel. The 3 men who remained on the deck, as well as everything else that was on the deck, washed overboard. Scotney, meanwhile, was thrown down, and he admitted that it took him some time to recover himself enough to realize what had happened. He was now alone on a small vessel that was still on beam ends and a third full of water, and the storm was still raging on. The 2 brigs that they had been traveling with were no longer in sight, and it was doubtful that they would be able to find one another in the storm that was still blowing. Once the storm had eased somewhat, he was able to take stock of the items that he had on board still. He had 3 pounds of flour, 6 pounds of bread, 2 porpoise tails, some salt, a little whale oil in the bottom of a barrel, and plenty of fresh water, though some of it had been tainted by salt water when the wave had crashed over the boat. He was also, fortunately, able to still steer the boat. It was not past the point of being able to navigate. His first thought was to head towards the coast of South America, but since he did not know how long the voyage would last, especially considering the condition of his vessel, he began to ration his food from the start, only allowing himself enough to eat to give himself the strength to navigate the Shallop, and nothing in addition. For 14 days, Scotney tried to sail his shallop in the direction he knew that the Rio de la Plata lay. But the entire time, the wind blew westerly and thwarted his every attempt. At times, new storms would also blow in and batter him and his boat. Scotney had the experience to know that the winds in the region primarily were westerly, but in his desperation, he had only focused on where the nearest land was, without any consideration for the likelihood that he would be able to reach it. Reluctantly, he turned his course to coincide more with the favors of the wind, and though it was further away, he decided to head to Tristan da Cunha. Here, it was possible that he would be reunited with the Thomas, so it was a course that had its own advantages. Unfortunately, he had used up a lot of time, and as a result precious supplies, in his attempt to reach Rio de la Plata. He now put himself on even more meager rations than before. Scotney had been on his new course towards the east when he saw some seabirds gathering around something in the water. He assumed that it was the remains of a fish that they were feeding on, and imagining that he might be able to get some food for himself from it, he directed his shallop to where the birds were flocking. As he drew closer, however, he had the horrifying discovery that what the birds were consuming was a person, past all recognition, though he did have the thought that it might be one of the sailors who were washed overboard when the wave struck the shallop. He did still make an effort to approach, his position too desperate to scorn any possibility of anything that could be consumed, no matter how horrifying. But he was not able to retrieve it, and he was forced to continue his voyage with the same provisions that he had started with. Nor was that the end of his bad luck. Scotney had intended to head to Tristan da Cunha, but accidentally overshot it. The same contrary winds that prevented him from reaching Rio de la Plata now prevented him from even attempting to turn back and try to reach Tristan da Cunha. His plan to reach his comrades and rejoin the Thomas was now completely abandoned, and he decided to try instead to reach the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope might have been the next logical destination, and one that would have been hard to miss, but by then his rations were so diminished that the chances of him surviving to reach it were incredibly slim. He was weakening quickly, to such an extent that he was no longer able to go into the hold of the ship to retrieve the little provisions that he had left, or even shift the helm as needed. He was now simply drifting, unable to help himself any longer. Out of desperation, Scotney turned his attention to one of the few things that was within his reach and offered any sustenance at all: the boat's medicine chest. In the medicine chest was tobacco, it still being believed at the time that tobacco smoke had medicinal benefits. With no other food that he could consume, Scotney shoved large amounts of tobacco into his mouth and chewed and sucked on it vigorously, in an attempt to keep himself going even a little while longer. Scotney did not seem to even have been aware of the approach of the ship the Europe until they called out to him around 8:30 in the morning on June 29th, 1803. As for the Europe, they were not certain that anyone was on board such a derelict vessel until Scotney made his appearance and begged for their assistance by waving his cap. The second mate of the Europe was immediately dispatched to go to his assistance on one of the ship's boats. They found on inspection that the food that remained that Scotney had not been able to reach for the past few days was about 2 ounces of biscuits, which were rotten and stunk to the extent that the rescuers were repulsed by them. Scotney admitted that he did not find them any more pleasant than they did. He had been breaking off tiny pieces at a time and turning them around in his mouth until he could force himself to swallow, but it was all he had. The second mate had Scotney, who had almost no use of his limbs, carried into the Europe's boat, and then allowed the wreck of the Shallop to drift away. The appearance of Scotney when he was carried on board the Europe was enough to excite everyone's attention, and multiple officers would later write about his terribly gaunt appearance. He was practically skeletal, and still had his cheeks stuffed full of tobacco, which he chewed and sucked on in a way that was described as convulsive. The doctor on board of the Europe estimated that if they had not found him, he would likely have only lasted 2 more days. He had in total been the only person on the ruined Shallop for 75 days, on what was later estimated by one account to have been only about an ounce of solid food per day. Was only after the Shallop had drifted away that they realized that Scotney's sea chest had still been on board it, with all of his clothing, and about 20 pounds. The Shallop was gone, so Captain Gilson of the Europe instead set up a collection for Scotney from his passengers and crew, contributing 10 pounds himself. The amount raised is said in some accounts to have been 50 pounds, and in others to have been 100 pounds, and maybe even a little over that. Either way, Scotney's losses would be to his well-being, rather than to his material wealth. Scotney was carefully nursed back to health by the crew of the Europe. Captain Gilson would report to the owners of the Europe that Scotney had made a full recovery, and had been entered into the ship's books as a member of the crew for the remainder of the voyage to Madras. But other accounts temper the statement of Scotney's health with a little more details. It was true that he was eventually able to move around again, and was entered as part of the ship's crew, but the role he took on was that of quartermaster, and he was placed on jobs that would not require much physical exertion. His strength was reported to have been permanently damaged by his ordeal. No one seems to have traced what happened to Scotney after he left the Europe. There are no reports of what he did next, where he went, or even if the two ships that the Shallop was separated from survived the storm. All further concerns seem to have been completely overshadowed by the fact that a man who had been floating on a wreck for 75 days, with almost no food, had still lived to tell the tale.
For more information, please see In the Middle Watch by William Clark Russell, published in 1905, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.